Okay, great. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about a few more things. We're not finished. So unfortunately, this is a great case study because it just introduces so many different influences on an organism like amphibians. So we're going to talk about some more things, some in some detail and others very briefly. So things like acid rain can change the pH of these aquatic habitats organisms are living in. And sometimes moving it outside of the range of pH that the frogs can handle. Pharmaceuticals, this is a very recent area of exploration for scientists, and a lot of pharmaceuticals are having some really strong effects on organisms like frogs and salmon and other aquatic organisms. Heavy metals we know can be toxic, especially things like mercury and lead, and so those can have negative impacts on amphibians as well, and mining effluent. So when we've seen pictures of like the Animas River in Colorado and a few years ago turning bright orange because of mining waste mixing with water, and then fracking fluids that have these proprietary mixes of solutions that they won't even tell us what they're using for fracking. These things can have really large impacts on fragile, or I guess susceptible organisms. What we'll spend more time talking about, though, are pesticides and a little bit of time talking about eutrophication. So atrazine is a pesticide, maybe not one that you've heard of. It's very commonly applied weed inhibitor, so it's particularly heavily applied in the Midwest. You can see by this map. It shows these yellow and orange regions with large doses of atrazine, about 80 million pounds per year. Only Roundup is used more heavily than atrazine, and it's very long-lived in the environment. It lasts between 2 and 100 days in the environment, where proponents of Roundup claim that it disappears in the sun in just a couple days. So atrazine has this possibility of really affecting aquatic ecosystems. This is Dr. Tyrone Hayes. He is both an endocrinologist and a herpetologist, someone who studies endocrine function and amphibians at the University of California, Berkeley. And he has studied frogs for a very long time. You can see him here with some of his lab animals. And he's very interested in the influences of pesticides like atrazine on endocrine function in frogs. So he published this paper in 2002 about the feminization of male frogs in the wild. And here you can see another map showing atrazine usage in the United States. And what he found was that this herbicide actually changes the sex of frogs from female to male in the wild. From male to female in the wild, and can influence population dynamics. So of course, if you are changing the sex ratios of a population, you can change the way in which they can repopulate. So what's interesting about this is that Tyrone Hayes was working for a company that, so a lot of the science funding can come directly from industry. So they want to make sure their products are doing what they want them to do. And sometimes that works out well, and sometimes that can be problematic. So in this case, Tyrone Hayes was working for a company called EcoRisk. And EcoRisk was basically a financial conduit between pesticide company Syngenta and independent researchers. So Syngenta was trying to hire independent researchers to study their products. Well, EcoRisk funded some of Tyrone's work with frogs and atrazine, and they didn't like what he came up with. So Tyrone Hayes decided to leave EcoRisk after some pressure to not publish certain things because he felt like he needed, as a scientist, he needed to publish the truth and the results that he was finding. So he leaves EcoRisk to conduct his own research at UC Berkeley. And around the same time, the European Union decided to ban atrazine, but the United States Environmental Protection Agency concluded in a panel that atrazine wasn't actually damaging. So what's interesting is that EcoRisk started funding other scientists to study atrazine, and they started publishing papers refuting Tyrone Hayes' work. But again, remember, they're being paid by the industry, so there's a lot of bias here, potential bias. The way that EPA works in the United States is that it has very specific requirements for the types of studies that it can use as evidence in its panels. And so around the same time, EPA starts convening a second panel. The scientists for Syngenta are publishing things that refute Tyrone's work, Dr. Hayes' work. And the company Syngenta basically starts a smear campaign against Dr. Hayes. And this goes on for many years. So Dr. Hayes starts getting these terrible emails. People show up at his talks at conferences, these kind of thugs that are very intimidating, and it gets really bad. And Tyrone continues to speak out against atrazine during this time. And so he becomes an advocate. He's a scientist. He starts advocating for more research. He starts kind of becoming an activist against atrazine. And he puts up some websites, and then they start attacking him more. And, it gets really ugly over the course of a few years. At the same time, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Dr. Catherine Proper, who's another endocrinologist, is sitting on the EPA's panel, and she's trying to weigh these papers, the industry papers against Tyrone Hayes' papers. And, and then there are these kind of, these very limited rules that the EPA uses to basically push some papers out. And so it turns out that a lot of Tyrone Hayes' papers can't be used in the atrazine panel because of the way that he went about his studies, and he didn't go about them wrong. He just didn't follow EPA's guidelines and rules for what are called best scientific practices, which are very limiting. And so anyway, the EPA panel tosses a whole bunch of papers out, but because of the way EcoRisk was doing their research, they didn't have to toss out these panels, the papers written by the Syngenta scientists. And so the EPA panel seems a little bit biased. Luckily, there are good scientists like Dr. Proper on the EPA panel. And so the EPA pressured the panel to say that atrazine was not a risk, but the panel refused. So basically, even though the system is kind of rigged for these industry scientists and industry papers, the panel is able to push back. And a lot of this is really challenging because if you're working with endocrinology, you're working on an issue that's human health related, but you're working in frogs. And so technically, it falls kind of in between the cracks of what are called the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. So National Science Foundation studies things that aren't health related, and NIH studies things that are health related. In this case, it's about frog health, and so it's kind of in between the two things. And so this is why a lot of those scientists need to work for industry. So anyway, Dr. Proper has known and respected Dr. Hayes for over 25 years, but she is concerned that his extreme advocacy negatively influenced his own credibility. So his experiences have made her wonder about her own work and her own advocacy. So this got so bad for Dr. Hayes and the smear campaign that Syngenta was running against him that he actually lost his funding for his lab. And UC Berkeley did not support him through this. So in 2013, things were looking very dire for Dr. Hayes, but he persevered. He pushed through. He did not back down. And this paper or this article was published in 2014. It basically is a vindication. So a class action lawsuit was brought against Syngenta and brought into light this conspiracy to discredit the scientist. His lab is now back up and running. UC Berkeley apologized. New donations are coming in, and his credibility has been restored. But it took 15 years of fighting really hard and fighting in the face of some really scary stuff. So now he's focused on the endocrine disrupting effects of nitrate, which is, of course, another harmful pollutant that we'll talk about when we talk more about the nitrogen cycle. So this case highlights a bunch of things for me. It talks about, it's part of the amphibian decline story. It's part of a story talking about kind of how do scientists act as advocates or act as, in the face of problems that we see, and when might we be stepping across a line. But it also highlights what are called indirect effects in ecology. So in this case, as Dr. Hayes is starting to work on nitrate, which is a fertilizer, what he might see are increases in algal growth. And along with increased algal growth, you might see a population boom of snails, which harbor this fluke parasite, which then might influence, more malformations in frogs. So this would be an example of an indirect effect on amphibians. And again, just shows that these poor frogs just can't catch a break. So fertilizers might actually have both a direct effect, as we'll see based on Tyrone's work on nitrate, and an indirect effect on frog mortality. So there might be similar effects that could be influencing human diseases, things like West Nile virus, the hantavirus, and Ebola. And so this chapter really highlights for me two things that I think are really important for you to understand. One is that ecology is the scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environments. And you really need to understand how organisms work from a biological perspective, but also how things in the environment can work. So things like chemistry and meteorology and earth system science. So this is why ecology is an upper division science area of study generally. And ecologists evaluate competing hypotheses about natural systems. And we use observations, experiments, and models. And so we're going to talk about a lot of these things as we go. The other thing is that ecology is really interdisciplinary. And so, to be an ecologist, you really have to have a broad understanding of a lot of different things, but you also have to be willing to collaborate. And so we can't know all of these things. If you look at this figure, you can see just kind of an overwhelming number of areas of study. Ecology is a lot more than just, animal planet kind of things. How do animals act and behave? And it's a lot more complex than just everything is in balance, and nature is always balanced, which I think are two kind of misconceptions that students often have about ecology. And so here's a few ecological maxims. You can never do just one thing. Everything goes somewhere. No population can increase in size forever. There is no free lunch. Evolution matters, time matters, space matters, and life can't exist in a vacuum. And we have to isolate factors. We can't study everything at once. It would be overwhelming to try to think about all of the factors affecting amphibians at once. And so most scientists will focus in on one or a few interacting factors to really try to understand these systems. And how do we work as ecologists? We use the scientific method. So we make an observation. So the first thing might be, wow, where are the frogs? What happened? I used to come to this lake all the time and see lots of frogs. What happened to them? Then we would frame some research questions. We might start to wonder why. And we might pose some questions that would be testable questions. And from these testable questions, we would formulate hypotheses. And then we would develop testable predictions based on the hypotheses that we would then use to gather data, test the predictions, and then decide whether we can reject the hypotheses that we posed or whether we need to refine them and collect more data. So you might go through this loop several times, developing new testable predictions, gathering new data, and then rejecting or not rejecting your hypotheses. And then eventually, hopefully, you'll come to the point where you can develop some general theories that then would feed back into making new observations about the world. So this is why we call it research. Like we're always searching. We're searching in new ways. We're asking new questions. And this is the scientific method. All right. I'll see you guys next time.